I'm starting a new beginning in my life. After a deep reflection on myself, I decided to take the next big step and localize to Christianity. And for all you Jesus heads out there, I finally did it. I found a console that was created in God's image. Wholesome, right?
Oh, God!
Would be anyone's reaction after hearing the absolute travesty that was the game crash in 1983. The game industry was in shambles. Nobody cared about video games anymore, and it's all because of 3 reasons. Too many consoles, no quality control, and the rise of home computers. I'm not gonna go too in-depth about the crash. That's mainly a second-gen thing, and hey, guess what I talked about last year? But what if I told you the same year the crash happened was when the 3rd generation started in Japan?
I didn't ask.
The family computer from Nintendo and the SG-1000 from Sega were released on the same day in the relatively small Japanese console market. Due to the size of the market there, or lack thereof, a crash never really happened in Japan. The crash was localized almost entirely in the United States.
Or did it? Because maybe the real crash in 1983 was the friends we made along the way.
The Atari 2600 didn't release in Japan until 1983, after both Nintendo and Sega's consoles came out. They just simply didn't have the same issues that we had over here. It took a couple years for America to get the 3rd gen started, but once it did, oh man, there was nothing like it. Starting off right at the beginning, Nintendo's family computer, aka the Famicom, marked the beginning of something alright. The Color TV game series of consoles wasn't lighting the world on fire. It was only released in Japan after all, and even then it wasn't the most popular thing out there. Sure, it was the best-selling series of consoles in the 1st generation, but this was a little bit before Nintendo decided to go all in with video games. Many people probably expected the Famicom to be an instant success, but believe it or not, it wasn't. Early models had a bad chipset, which caused early models of the Famicom to crash.
So the crash really did happen over there.
Nintendo had to recall the Famicom, give it a new motherboard, and after that, the Famicom still took a bit to gain traction. Now let's talk about the console itself. This controller layout is one of the most iconic things out there. The classic D-pad and 2-button combo almost didn't happen. In place of the D-pad, Nintendo was about to put joysticks on the controllers until someone slapped a Game & Watch D-pad on a prototype controller, and they found it to be way more comfortable than the joystick. Also, the second controller has a microphone. Why? I don't know, probably for shits and giggles. But for the first 2 years, the Famicom struggled to sell much. It was doing better than the competitors, sure, but it took a f***ing plumber for the Famicom to become the behemoth it eventually became. Super Mario Bros. Released in 1985 and propelled the Famicom to success. Because of that game alone, Nintendo sold 4 million units in 1985. It was the one game you had to play. You could either get a Famicom and play the must-have title in 1985, or you can reject society and go play Flicky. Yeah, I sure wonder which console was more successful.
The one that can play Pachinko too! It's better than Pachinko. It has a 2 at the end.
Despite the 2 consoles coming out on the exact same day, the Sega SG-1000 was made in response to the Famicom. Honestly, it only made sense for Sega to start making home consoles. Not only have they made games for other systems, but by the early 80s, they were incredibly popular at arcades. Their success in the video game industry and Nintendo's upcoming Famicom led to Sega releasing the SG-1000, which stands for the Sega Game 1000.
That explains a lot. The whole time I thought it meant Sega Gaga.
If you take a hard look at the name, it is a little weird. Sega already stands for Service Games, so the legal name of the SG-1000 is the Service Games Game 1000. We're experiencing 1st generation disease here. The SG-1000 released alongside Sega's home computer, the SC-3000. I'm pretty sure it's self-evident what that C stands for.
Crotch!
The SG-1000 was only released by Sega themselves in Japan. However, it did have official releases in Australia and New Zealand. Unofficially, there was the Telegames Personal Arcade, which was a clone released in Taiwan, and interestingly enough, the United States, which this clone was able to play both SG-1000 and ColecoVision titles. The SG-1000 sold triple Sega's expectations by the end of 1983, partly due to the fact that by this time, the SG had 21 games available and the Famicom only had 9, as well as the Famicom Recall being a thing. However, the Famicom still remained the more popular choice because Nintendo had the more recognizable titles. While Nintendo only had 3 launch titles for the Famicom, these games were Donkey Kong, Donkey Kong Jr., and Popeye. It's a bit bit hard to find what games the SG launched with. Some sites say that the console had a handful of games released for it, others say it had a single game, which was Borderline, which, yeah, if that's your only competition against Donkey Kong, I don't think you stand a chance. I think another game was Starjacker. Like, come on, Sega, that's what I do on Reddit on a nightly basis. However, despite falling in Nintendo's shadow, the SG-1000 did sell more than the other contemporaries. By 1984, the Famicom started to outpace the SG-1000. It was cheaper, was more powerful, and Nintendo was making deals with third parties left and right, ultimately giving them a way bigger library. Sega didn't want their arcade competitors to be releasing games for the SG-1000 because they didn't want to lose sales from software. By the end of its life, the SG-1000 only had 71 games in total, 29 of which required the Sega Card Catcher add-on, as those games were on Sega cards and couldn't be played on the SG-1000 without them. Compare that to the 1,260 games you can play on the Famicom, and although 200 of those were for the Famicom Disk System add-on, that's still over 1,000 games you can play on just the base Famicom. That didn't stop Sega from releasing a redesign of the SG-1000 on July 31st that same year.
Which was called the SG-2000, right? Right?
The Sega SG-1002, aka the Mark II, was an update of the original SG-1000. The biggest changes are obviously the design itself, but the controllers got updated as well to look more like the Famicom controller. You see, the original controller was begging for a redesign. It looks like it'd snap if I just hurt its feelings. Plus, the Mark II had a second controller port. Now you and a buddy can play, Hustle Chummy. Yeah, the Mark II didn't do so great. Many people saw it as nothing more than a redesign. If you didn't already have the Mark I, sure, get the 2, but you didn't really need one if you had the other. This design was almost only released in Japan, but Sega looked at Taiwan with their bootleg Mark I and said, sure, here you go. Over a year after the Mark II being a thing, Sega made the next logical step and decided to release the Mark III. Yes, on October 20th, 1985, Sega pushed out the Mark III into the Japanese market, but unlike the Mark II, the 3 was basically a new console. It looks incredibly similar to the Mark II, straight up to the point where an untrained eye could mistake the two systems. But don't be fooled, the Mark III is a beast of its own. While a lot of aspects of the Mark III are the same as the SG-1000, the biggest upgrade is with the graphics. The SG-1000 fell way behind the Famicom graphically, however the Mark III was actually better than the Famicom. A card slot was added in front of the cartridge slot that let players use Sega cards. No, these don't store money, but they were a very cost-effective way to store games. For a full 8 months, despite this thing having a cartridge slot, not a single cartridge was produced for the Mark III. However, the game Fantasy Zone made Sega start producing carts again. During those 8 months though, if you were really needing to use that cartridge slot, well, the Mark III was backwards compatible with all the SG-1000 titles. Though the Mark III barely put a dent in Nintendo's install base. While Sega stayed strong, the Mark III only sold over 1.7 million units. In Japan. You may say, are you out of your mind? The Mark III didn't make it out of Japan. You're technically not wrong. You see, if you live in the red outline on this map, you did actually get the Mark III. Yeah, look through every console released in America, you're not gonna see a Sega Mark III anywhere, but you will see the Master System. Yes, the Sega Master System was the international title of the Mark III, and this thing sold 10 to 13 million units. Sega in 1986 established Sega of America, and later that year released the Master System nationwide. By the end of the year, Sega came in second place. In third was Atari at 100K, first was Nintendo at 1.1 million, and Sega, Christ, Sega, at least they outsold Atari, but ever since the 5200 came out, beating Atari wasn't much of a feat, and it's not like they outsold them by much. The Master System didn't do terrible in America, but it fell flat on its face compared to Nintendo, and in 1987, the Mark III re-released as the Master System in Japan.
Give up, Sega.
Most of the Master System's success wasn't in either Japan or America, but this thing did numbers in Europe and Brazil. You see, Europe was easy. Nintendo actually failed to make much of an impression over there. While the NES was released in PAL territories, it's not like much was done to make people consider one over home computers like the Commodore 64 and the ZX Spectrum. Sega had the bright idea to market the Master System as an alternative to those two. And it worked. By 1990, the Sega Master System was the best-selling console in Europe. Distributor Virgin Masteronic,
do I need to put 2 on the innuendo board, or is just 1 okay?
reported 150,000 Master Systems sold in 1990 alone. Compare that to Nintendo's 80,000. Even the Sega Mega Drive, which was the 4th-gen successor to the Master System, was only selling 60,000 units that year. In all of Europe that year, Sega sold 725,000 units, while Nintendo only sold 655,000. And the year after, a whopping 1,745,000 Master Systems were sold. But yeah, we can't mention the Master System without mentioning Brazil.
It's the only way you can get me to mention them.
Over there, the Master System was being distributed by the company Tectoy. Releasing in 1989, the Master System actually had a huge head start over Nintendo, who wouldn't enter the Brazilian console market until 1993 and didn't really compete much due to NES clones dominating the Brazilian market. In fact, the Master System was big enough in Brazil that there were 22 games exclusively released there, including a port of Street Fighter 2.
Because where else would you play Street Fighter 2? I'm pissed scared of playing it on something that isn't the Master System.
Most of these games were nothing more than Game Gear ports, which the Game Gear is essentially just a portable Master System. Just like how Mickey's Ultimate Challenge was a Game Gear game, it was also the last game ever released on the Master System in 1998. However, if you didn't live in Brazil, your last Master System title was Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991. Now speak to any random Joe who knows anything about the Master System, and they'll tell you that the Master System is still being sold in Brazil. It is still sold over there, but it's not what you'd expect. They aren't producing the same old Master System from yesteryear and selling that. The Master Systems still sold in Brazil are consoles that come with 100 plus built-in titles. So to say that the Master System is still being sold in Brazil is to say that the Genesis is still being sold today through those at-games mini consoles, as it's basically the same thing. But Sega wasn't the first to make it overseas. Nintendo beat them by a year, sorta kinda. Yes, the NES was released in America in 1985, technically. On October 27th, 1985, the Nintendo Entertainment System was released exclusively in New York.
Woo!
Then finally, the NES was released in February of 1986. In Los Angeles. Then finally, the NES was released nationwide on September 27th, 1986. The NES was planned to come out earlier as the Nintendo Advanced Video Gaming System, which is a shuddering thing to think about. Imagine we were calling this thing the NAVS. Originally supposed to be a Nintendo and Atari joint, Atari got pretty pissed when they saw Coleco demonstrating the Coleco Atom home computer with Donkey Kong. The thing is, while Coleco had the rights for the console versions of Donkey Kong, Atari had the rights to the home computer versions, which led to Atari delaying their marketing contract with Nintendo, and when the at the time CEO of Atari, Ray Kassar, got fired, Nintendo was done tapping their foot and checking their watch, so they just decided to do it themselves. So they came up with a better name for the console, the Nintendo Advanced Video System. God damn it. This iteration of the NES was supposed to be a repackaged Famicom with a keyboard, a cassette data recorder, and wireless controllers. They were trying to copy off the Odyssey 2.
Nintendo, ever since the beginning, has never made sense.
Then yeah, after that, they picked up their shit and made the thing we all know and love today. Nintendo of America's approach to saving the video game industry in America was to say,
video games? Never heard of her. This is a toy.
And it entirely worked. Oh, the NES console? No, dude, that's the control DAC cartridges. Please, these are game packs. The system was originally packaged with peripherals like the NES Zapper and Rob the Robot to give the impression that this just wasn't a video game system. Though they didn't want to market it too much like a toy, like they redesigned the system entirely from the Famicom to avoid it looking like a child's toy, even if on a technical level, it's basically just a Famicom. Nintendo even wanted to avoid the poor quality control by releasing every game with the Nintendo seal of quality, which led to IGN calling this the best system of all time.
And this is why we can't trust you, IGN.
Yes, the NES saved the video game industry in America. Yes, the NES had some stellar titles, but for every Punch-Out, there's like 10 super pitfalls. The NES certainly had a better library than the Atari, but it also doesn't have the best library. Games like Super Mario 3, Kirby's Adventure, Mega Man 2, and Contra are absolutely stellar, but then again, you probably have the entirety of the LJN library. The NES is not a perfect console. That's not to say there's ever been a perfect console, but as someone who shares a release date with Madden 06, people who call the NES the best console ever are probably looking at the console with the rosiest, tintiest glasses ever. It was the best console of its time, though. I don't think we can just skim past that. Even when the Genesis came out in 1989, Nintendo releasing Super Mario Bros. 3 overseas in 1990 overshadowed the 16-bit Butte. Many prominent game series originated on this little thing. Super Mario, Zelda, Mega Man, Castlevania, Final Fantasy, and Dragon Quest, just to name a few. The industry truly wouldn't be the same without the NES. By the time the successor came out, 1 in 4 American homes had one, and almost 100% of homes with kids aged 8 to 15 had one. The NES not only saved the video game industry in America, but it also defined the third generation. The Nintendo Entertainment System was discontinued in 1995, and the Famicom was discontinued in 2003. This thing just didn't give up.
Which is something that Atari should have done a long time ago.
The Atari 7800 was released in this generation, and I think I said a while back that it was a successful console. Atari only had two consoles that did well. Obviously the 2600, but also the 7800. I'm also a fucking moron. Yeah, Atari's only success in the home console market was the 2600. The 7800 did beat the NES and the Master System to the nationwide market, even if the NES was already out in the test regions of NY and LA when the 7800 released. It did release before the NES released nationwide and before the Master System even came out in America. Atari learned from the 5200 and included backwards compatibility with the 2600, which honestly didn't really matter because people were probably calling the 2600 that fucking thing by this point. While it could play the entirety of the 2600's library, it also had like 50 games to call its own. At the beginning of 1987, Atari reported that 100,000 7800 consoles had been sold. There were 1 million consoles sold by June of 1988. Who the fuck was buying this thing en masse? Well, the 7800 was just a drop in the bucket in the third gen of consoles, and hopefully, Atari would never make another home console ever again. Oh, fuck.
The third generation of consoles was when consoles really started to become a staple in the living room. The NES being the most popular thing since sliced bread was truly something that Odyssey or 2600 couldn't have done. I mean, the NES had Super Mario Bros. The Odyssey just had f***ing numbers for games, and the 2600 had tax avoiders. Which, hey Atari, I play video games to escape reality, not to play it.
It goes without saying that the NES/Famicom won this generation, both in America and Japan. It blew past all the other competition, and while Sega did have some redeeming qualities, it's not like they could have beat the NES. No way. While Sega actually did win over in Europe and Brazil, overall, yeah, Nintendo totally won this one. Not only did they popularize home consoles in Japan, but they also revitalized the industry over in America, while Atari sat in a corner and ate glue. It's not like Atari didn't put up a fight, but they also didn't try. In terms of other consoles, there were definitely more than just the four I talked about, but the MyVision, anybody? Or what about the VTech Socrates? Yup, we're getting philosophical in this one. There weren't any handhelds in the third gen, or handhelds worth mentioning at all. The Game & Watch series is still getting new titles, though that released in the second gen, and the Game Boy is primarily a fourth gen thing. It is really weird that I associate the Game Boy closely with the NES, even though it spent most of its life alongside the SNES. Like, there was a cartridge for the SNES that played Game Boy games.
Stupid, stupid, stupid!
The fourth generation of consoles started with the release of the PC Engine by NEC in 1987, which released in North America as the TurboGrafx 16 in 1988. At the end of it all, the third generation lasted from 1983, and the last console to be discontinued was the Famicom in 2003, which is absolutely nuts that it was one of the consoles that started the entire generation. Nintendo would eventually end support in 2007 when they stopped repairing Famicoms due to a shortage of parts.
And the church has ended support of me because I totally talked smack about the NES and praised the Master System, which is the system of the devil. I wonder if I could be forgiven at this point. God, please forgive me. I know you're up there, and I'm sorry for praising Sega.
If I were you, I'd just kill myself to get to hell quicker.
Thanks, God.